Slinking out of the darkness with an all-too-wide smile was her childhood acquaintance and neighborhood nightmare, Jocelyn Aldred. One monster she dearly wished she'd never cross paths with again in all her miserable existence. But here she was, breaking her New Year promise to herself and catching up, as Jocelyn put it with her characteristic sickeningly sweet smile. But those dark beady eyes never reflected what her smile showed, and it usually didn't. However, things had started out normal enough. She just wanted to catch up on things about what was going on between them in their lives. Of course, Sandra was expected to talk first, and as she did, she made damn sure to give the bare minimum of her life. How she missed school, wanted to travel the world and meet people beyond just that dismal city, and to pursue her dream, whatever it would end up being. Yeah, underneath Jocelyn's sharp eyes, it was very hard to keep anything to herself. But she was relieved when Jocelyn didn't make any scathing comments or anything that usual. Instead, she moved on to talking about herself, pouring out her own feelings and what she had experienced in her life. She became very dramatic, going on and on about how poor her life ended up turning out, her parents abandoning her with her neglectful brothers for the sake of their religious jobs, one of her favorite, or most tolerated rather, brothers going MIA and leaving her behind with the most awful person imaginable. She went on about how she barely got anything to eat, had little to no clothes for herself, and on about her supposedly awful living conditions. Sandra stared at her quietly. Why? Was there something wrong with that? Sandra reflected back on her own life, finding a commonality in some of the things she had described. While her family situation wasn't the same, unfortunately, she found the rest of it to be relatable to her and wondered why they were all a problem to begin with. When Sandra looked up to continue listening to the girl, she was startled to see Jocelyn fixing her with an unnerving stare, and Sandra realized she was expecting an entirely different reaction out of her. She realized her mistake when a small and unsettling smile started to pull at the corners of Jocelyn's mouth. Sandra knew she was up to something, but her heart stopped and eyes widened at what Jocelyn had next implied. He does much more awful things to me at home, though. Sandra's stomach then proceeded to drop when Jocelyn, with that very same demented smile, went into grisly detail about even more things she could relate to. The stories resembling her own stories down to the very minute detail. They were literally her stories. How did she know? She didn't know how she found out, but she knew it was all very much false. She had met her brother, both of them in fact, and while it wasn't enough to get a real sense of who and how they were at home behind closed doors, she just knew they would never do. He would never do all of what her own family was guilty of. And it only got worse when Jocelyn then went into the darker moments that Sandra herself had went through and never wanted to revisit. So the fact that Jocelyn was literally speaking about these things, practically reflecting her insecurities back at her, it was all so... Never had she felt so disrespected. It was as though Jocelyn was taking all her trauma and life experiences and laughing as she threw them all back into her face harshly. Sandra didn't know what Jocelyn was playing at, what sick, demented scheme she had on her mind. But Sandra was done. She called Jocelyn out for what she was doing, and while she was at it, also released all the pent-up emotion she had suppressed throughout all her life of knowing her. The terror, the anger, the disgust, everything. They swelled from the very pits of her deadened soul within a spark of fire she'd honestly not ever felt before. And it was all so liberating. All that time of living in fear, just tired of having practically everyone walk all over her, use her up, and take advantage of all of her entire being. It was all going to stop then and there. There was a beat of silence between the two of them. Jocelyn staring at Sandra with an almost speechless astonishment on her face, which gave Sandra a flare of triumph, her heart fluttering at the prospect she might have finally won. But all that became dashed when Jocelyn let out a high-pitched giggle, which then evolved into an absolutely unhinged cackle, one that could only be heard from the chest of a pure psychopath. And it terrified Sandra so much, firmly reminding her exactly why she feared this girl so much. All she wanted was to watch people hurt, to kick people while they were down, apathetic to the choices she made and how it would inevitably affect others. And she had no doubt that Jocelyn had gotten people killed at some point in her life. Sandra believed she was just that fucked up in the head to do so. Subconsciously, she took a step back, and then another, just feeling like this mad girl was swathed in a toxic poison that would no doubt kill her if she had remained in that area any longer than she already had. Jocelyn ceased her laughing, grinning maniacally at Sandra with a venomous stare that made her already rapid heartbeat pick up its pace even more. Sandra's blood ran cold when Jocelyn hissed at her, going on her own rant about how much she hated Sandra for even existing, but how she also envied her for everything as well. Sandra couldn't believe it, finding that she herself envied Jocelyn for everything good going for her in her own life, and how her own had been nothing but a living hell. However, Jocelyn didn't seem to really agree. She learned from her and Sandra's little chat that she realized just how stupid she was to do so. Throughout her little assessment, she had begun to slowly advance on Sandra, forcing the terrified girl to back up and retain whatever distance possible between them. But it wasn't too long before she found her feet at the very edge of the ravine that she then realized she had nowhere else to go. Upon facing Jocelyn again, she didn't miss the new eager glint in the girl's eyes, her grin stretching wickedly across her demented face. And Sandra knew that her time was up. The devil that was hidden from everyone's eyes but was known to exist by only her had finally showed itself in her final hour. And all hope of survival was bare to none. Pain clawed her heart at the thought of Jocelyn's older brother, the only man to ever show her a kindness and care she never got in her own life, and that made anguished yearning sear through her gut at the fact she would never see him again. Wherever he was, she hoped he was all right, and sullenly thought to herself, if only she had him as her family instead. Then, in a quick motion with no hesitation, Jocelyn shot forward and shoved her backwards, and she suddenly found herself falling into dark abyssal blackness. She watched the split in the earth grow further and further away, and the form of the girl peering over the edge became smaller and smaller as well. Wind whistled loudly and deafeningly into her ears, tousling her hair and clothing violently every which way. But she didn't scream. In fact, she didn't know if she felt anything at that moment at all. All she really knew was that she was weightless in her heart and mind as the darkness closed in on her rapidly, before it abruptly swallowed her whole.